the photograph that proved the Holocaust was happening, and nobody stopped at the Einsatzgruppen, Ukraine 1942, and the image the world was never supposed to see. There is a photograph that has been described by historians as one of the most important documents of the 20th century, not because of its technical quality, not because of who took it, but because of what it captured, and because the man who took it intended it as a souvenir. The photograph shows a German policeman standing in an open field somewhere near the village of Ivanhorod, in German-occupied Ukraine. He is wearing a standard military uniform. His posture is calm, deliberate. His rifle is raised. In front of him, close enough that the barrel nearly touches her, stands a woman. She is bent slightly forward, her arms wrapped around a small child, her child, using her own body as a shield. Both of them are facing the gun. The inscription on the back of the photograph, written in German, is brief and administrative. It reads, Ukraine 1942, Juden Action, Iwangarod. Jewish Action, Ivanhorod. That is all. A bureaucratic caption for an act of murder, written by the man who sent the photograph home in an envelope through the military postal service as a record of his day's work. He never received it. A teenage boy working at the Warsaw post office, a member of the Polish underground resistance named Jerzy Tomaszewski, intercepted it. He recognized immediately what it was. He kept it. He hid it. He sent a copy to the Polish government in exile in London as documentary evidence of what was happening in the occupied territories. Evidence that many people in the West were still struggling to believe was real. The original photograph now resides in the historical archives in Warsaw. Today we are going to tell the full story behind that photograph. Not just what it shows, but what it represents. Who carried out the operation it depicts. How they were organized, trained, and ordered. How many people they killed, how the world found out, and what happened, or more accurately, what failed to happen when it did. This is the story of the Einsatzgruppen, the machine before the killing, how the Einsatzgruppen were built. The word Einsatzgruppen translates from German as deployment groups or operational groups. The bureaucratic neutrality of the name was not accidental. The entire apparatus of the Nazi state's mass murder program was built around language that displaced the reality of what was happening behind administrative terminology, special tasks, Jewish actions, resettlement, final solution. The language was designed to create distance between the act and its description, to allow men to write administrative reports about mass murder using the same vocabulary they might use for any other military operation. The Einsatzgruppen were formed under the direction of SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, who was chief of the Reich Main Security Office. The RSHA, the central headquarters of the Nazi security apparatus. Heydrich was perhaps the most operationally capable official in the entire SS hierarchy, a man whose administrative intelligence and willingness to pursue the system's murderous logic to its absolute conclusion made him, in the assessment of many historians, among the most dangerous individuals in the Third Reich's leadership. He would be assassinated in Prague in May 1942 by Czech and Slovak paratroopers trained by the British Special Operations Executive, one of the few successful targeted killings of a senior Nazi official during the entire war. But in 1939, Heydrich was building the instrument that would become the primary killing mechanism of the Holocaust's first phase. The Einsatzgruppen were not new in concept when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. They had first been deployed during the invasion of Poland in September 1939, where they had killed thousands of Jewish men and members of the Polish intelligentsia, teachers, priests, lawyers, academics, anyone in the Nazi racial hierarchy, considered a potential source of resistance or leadership in the occupied territory. The Poland operations established a precedent. Mobile SS and police units following the Wehrmacht advance, targeting specific categories of people for immediate execution without charge, trial, or any process of law whatsoever. What changed with Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, on June 22, 1941, was the scale, the explicitness of the targeting, and the organizational sophistication of what these units were ordered to do. For Einsatzgruppen were organized for the Soviet campaign. Each was designated by a letter, A, B, C, and D. Each was assigned to operate behind a specific army group advancing into Soviet territory. Einsatzgruppe A operated behind Army Group North, advancing through the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, toward Leningrad. Its area of operations encompassed communities with Jewish populations that had lived in the region for centuries, concentrated in cities like Kovna, Riga, and Vilna. Einsatzgruppe operated behind Army Group Center, advancing through Belorussia toward Moscow. Its operational area included Minsk and the vast Pripyat Marshes region, where large Jewish populations had existed since the medieval period. Einsatzgruppe C operated behind Army Group South, advancing through Ukraine. This was the unit responsible for the Ivan Horod photograph. It was this unit, specifically Sonderkommando 4A, a subordinate unit of Einsatzgruppe C led by SS Standartenführer Paul Blobel, that conducted the massacre at Babi Yar, outside Kiev, in September 1941. 33,771 people in 2 days. Einsatzgruppe D operated in the southernmost sector, through Moldova, the Crimea, and the Caucasus. The total personnel of all 4 Einsatzgruppen at their formation in 1941 was approximately 3,000 men. 3,000. That number requires emphasis, because it is important for understanding what followed. 3,000 men killed more than 1 million people in the first 9 months of the Soviet campaign alone. They did not do this alone. They were supported by Wehrmacht units, by order police battalions, by Waffen-SS formations, and by local collaborators recruited from among the populations of the occupied territories, particularly in the Baltic states and Ukraine, where pre-existing anti-Semitism and resentment of Soviet rule created a pool of men willing to assist. The orders, what they were told to do, and how it escalated, understanding what the Einsatzgruppen were ordered to do, and how those orders changed through the summer of 1941, is essential to understanding the Ivan Horod photograph and the operation it depicts. When the Einsatzgruppen first moved into Soviet territory in June 1941, their initial orders targeted adult male Jews, Soviet Communist Party officials, and political commissars. The stated rationale was military security, the removal of potential sources of partisan resistance behind the advancing front lines. This language of military necessity was important, because it provided the Wehrmacht commanders who were asked to cooperate with the Einsatzgruppen a justification they could use to square the operations with their own professional self-image as soldiers rather than killers of civilians. But the scope of the killings began expanding almost immediately. By late July 1941, barely a month after the invasion began, Reinhard Heydrich issued a directive, reportedly delivered in person, at a meeting in Valeka, criticizing Einsatzgruppen commanders for what he considered insufficient execution numbers. The order that followed extended the target category to include women and children. The first recorded killing of women and children alongside men occurred on July 30th, 1941, in Valeka. From that point forward, the operations were no longer targeted at a category of individual considered a security threat. They were targeted at a category of person defined by ancestry. The operational pattern that the Einsatzgruppen established across thousands of locations in the occupied Soviet territories followed a consistent sequence that can be reconstructed from the unit's own reports, the Erinnerungsmeldungen, or event reports, that were sent back to RSHA headquarters in Berlin after each operation, and which survived the war, to become some of the most damning documentary evidence against the perpetrators. Local Jewish populations were identified through community records, through the forced registration of all Jews imposed immediately upon occupation, and through the intelligence of local collaborators who knew the community. Announcements were made, sometimes posted, sometimes delivered through community leaders, ordering all Jews to assemble at a designated location at a specific time, often with the instruction to bring several days' worth of food and their valuables, with the implication that they were being resettled to a new location. Many people, having no framework for understanding what was actually planned, complied. Some did not. They fled or hid or tried to warn others. But in community after community, across a geographic area spanning from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the pattern repeated itself with brutal regularity. The assembled population was marched or transported to a location outside the town or village. A pit had been dug, sometimes by the victims themselves, sometimes by labor units, sometimes by the killing squad's own personnel. The killing was conducted by shooting. The bodies were covered. The The unit moved on. The reports that came back to Berlin recorded the numbers with administrative precision. Einsatzgruppe's Operational Situation Report Number 9, dated July 1st, 1941, recorded 4,239 killed. Report Number 14 recorded an additional 3,387. These were not estimates. These were enumerated tallies, reported up the chain of command, tabulated and filed in the RSHA offices in Berlin, just as any other operational statistics will be filed. By the end of 1941, 6 months after Barbarossa began, more than 500,000 people have been killed by the Einsatzgruppen and their supporting units. More than 500,000 people in 6 months. By the end of the war, the historian Raoul Hilberg's exhaustive analysis of the documentary record estimated that the Einsatzgruppen and the related killing operations they coordinated had killed more than 2 million people, including approximately 1.3 million of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. This is the organizational and operational context for what is depicted in the Ivan Horod photograph. What the camera captured in that field in Ukraine in 1942 was not an isolated act of individual violence. It was one instance of an operation that was being carried out simultaneously across an entire continent by a specific bureaucratic structure under explicit orders from a chain of command that extended to the highest levels of the Nazi state. Ukraine, 1942. What was happening when the photograph was taken? By 1942, when the Ivan Horod photograph was taken, the Einsatzgruppe had been operating in Ukraine for the better part of a year. The large-scale operations of 1941, the mass shootings at Babi Yar, at Dnipropetrovsk, at Kharkov, had killed the majority of Ukraine's urban Jewish populations. What continued in 1942 were what the perpetrators' own terminology described as mop-up operations, the systematic extension of killing to smaller communities, rural villages, and the people who had survived the initial 1941 sweeps by hiding, by fleeing, or simply by not being present when the first operation came through their area. Ivan Horod, the village name used in the caption on the back of the photograph, is in the Kiev Oblast of Ukraine, in the Uman district. It was a small settlement in agricultural country, the kind of place where a Jewish population might have lived for generations as farmers, traders, craftsmen, and community members embedded in the social fabric of the region, since before anyone living there in 1942 could remember. By the time the photograph was taken, every Jew in Ivan Horod and the surrounding area had been classified as an enemy of the German state, not because of anything they had done, but because of what they were. The woman in the photograph, whose name we do not know, who has never been identified, whose story before that moment is entirely lost to history, was in that field because a unit that had come to her village had rounded up the remaining Jewish population and marched them to that location. The child she is holding, also unidentified, also a person of whom nothing is known except that last image, was with her because the child was hers, and because a mother does not leave her child when men with guns tell her to walk. The photograph was taken by someone present at the operation. It was not taken by the man pulling the trigger. He has his rifle raised. It was taken by another member of the unit, who framed the shot, held still, pressed a shutter, and produced a composed image of the moment before an execution. The man who took it then sent it home in the mail. He wrote the caption on the back himself. He considered it worth keeping, worth sending, worth the cost of postage. This tells us something important about the psychological state of the men conducting these operations, something that historians and psychologists have wrestled with for decades and have never fully resolved. The man who took that photograph was not behaving as someone who knew he was doing something wrong. He was behaving as someone documenting an experience, the way a soldier might photograph a tank or a foreign landscape or a destroyed building. The act of photographing was an act of normalization. It said, "This is part of my experience here, and I want a record of it." The German military command eventually issued orders prohibiting the photography of killing operations, partly from concerns about military discipline and partly from a growing awareness that the photographic record being created constituted evidence. But those orders came too late to prevent a significant body of documentation from being created and distributed through the military postal system. Some of it was intercepted, as this photograph was. More of it reached its destinations and sat in family albums and shoeboxes and attic trunks across Germany, emerging decades later in ways that historians and prosecutors have used to reconstruct the operations and identify the perpetrators. The Boy at the Post Office: How the Photograph Survived. The Polish resistance movement during the Second World War was one of the most sophisticated and courageous underground organizations in occupied Europe. Facing an occupying power that had declared the Polish nation essentially non-existent, that had annexed Western Poland directly into the Reich, converted Central Poland into a colonial territory called the General Government, and physically removed or killed the Polish professional and intellectual classes as part of a systematic effort to destroy Poland as a functioning society. The resistance built networks of intelligence, communication, sabotage, and documentation that operated under conditions of extraordinary danger. Among the activities of the resistance was the systematic interception and analysis of German military postal traffic passing through Warsaw. The Warsaw Post Office was a node through which enormous quantities of correspondence between the Eastern Front and Germany passed. Resistance members who had infiltrated or taken employment in the postal system, at great personal risk, since discovery meant death, monitored this traffic for militarily valuable information and for evidence of atrocities that could be documented and transmitted to the Polish government in exile in London. Jerzy Tomaszewski was a teenager when he encountered the photograph that would become the most famous piece of photographic evidence of the Holocaust in Ukraine. He was working with an underground photography laboratory called PhotoRis, developing and reproducing clandestine photographs taken by the resistance. When he intercepted the envelope containing the Ivan Horde photograph, with its German-language caption describing a Judenaction in 1942 Ukraine, he understood immediately what he was holding. He kept the original. He sent a copy to London. He maintained possession of the photograph through the remainder of the occupation, through the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, through the destruction of the city, and through the post-war years. The photograph was first published in 1959 in a book titled 1939 to 1945. We Have Not Forgotten, produced by the Society of Fighters for Freedom and Democracy in Poland. It appeared on the cover. It has not been out of circulation since. In the 1960s, an attempt was made by some quarters to dismiss the photograph as a communist forgery. This claim required explaining away the physical evidence of the photograph itself, the corroborating documentation of Einsatzgruppe's operations in the Uman district of Ukraine in 1942, and the entire body of survivor testimony and perpetrator records that documented operations of precisely this kind being conducted in that area at that time. The claim was examined by photography experts and historians and found to be without foundation. The photograph is authentic. The event it depicts is real. Photograph historian Janina Struck has described it as a symbol of the barbarity of the Nazi regime and their industrial-scale murder of 6 million European Jews. That description is accurate as far as it goes. But the photograph is something more specific than a symbol. It is documentation. It is a record of a specific event, in a specific location, on a specific date, carried out by specific people operating within a specific organizational structure. Everything about it can be placed in historical context. And that historical context is precisely what makes it so important. The scale, numbers that resist comprehension. The challenge of writing about the Einsatzgruppen is a challenge of all Holocaust history. The numbers are so large that they resist genuine comprehension. The human mind is not equipped to process 1 million deaths as a number in the same way it processes smaller quantities. The brain that can immediately grasp the loss represented by 1 death or 5 or 20 confronts something qualitatively different when the number reaches 100,000 or 500,000 or 2 million. Historian Raoul Hilberg, whose 3-volume work, The Destruction of the European Jews, remains a foundational text of Holocaust scholarship, estimated that the Einsatzgruppen and the organizations working alongside them killed more than 2 million people between 1941 and 1945. That figure includes approximately 1.3 million Jews, roughly 1/5 of all Jewish victims of the Holocaust, and approximately 700,000 non-Jewish Soviet citizens, including Communist Party officials, Roma, people with disabilities, and anyone else who fell within the expanding categories of targets that the operations included. In Ukraine alone, the land where the Ivan Horde photograph was taken, between 1.5 and 2 million Jews were killed during the German occupation. Most of them were killed by shooting. Most of those shootings were conducted by Einsatzgruppe, and the Order Police and Wehrmacht units supporting it. Most of the shootings were carried out at outdoor sites, in ravines and forests, in fields, within walking distance of communities where the victims had lived. The Babi Yar massacre stands as the single largest shooting action in the entire history of the Holocaust. In 2 days, September 29th and 30th, 1941, Sonderkommando 4A of Einsatzgruppe C, supported by Order Police units and Ukrainian auxiliary police, shot 33,771 people in the Babi Yar ravine outside Kiev. The operation was recorded in the unit's own reports, submitted to Berlin, and filed. After the war, when Soviet forensic investigators examined the site, they found the remains of tens of thousands of people in a ravine that had been used repeatedly as a killing site through the remainder of the German occupation of Kiev. In Lithuania, Einsatzgruppe A and its supporting units killed approximately 195,000 of the 200,000 Jews who lived in the country before the invasion. 97.5% of Lithuania's Jewish population, a community that had existed in that territory for more than 500 years, that had produced a rich and distinctive culture of scholarship, art, and religious life, gone in less than a year. At Rumbula, outside Riga, Latvia, 25,000 to 28,000 Jews were shot over 2 days in November and December 1941. At Ponary, outside Vilna in Lithuania, more than 70,000 people were killed in a wooded area that became one of the largest killing sites in the entire region. These numbers were not hidden from the Nazi leadership. They were reported. The Meldungen, event reports, were distributed to senior RSHA officials, including Heinrich Himmler, who received regular summaries of the killing statistics. The reports were produced with the same administrative thoroughness that characterized a broader Nazi bureaucracy. They listed dates, locations, unit designations, and victim counts with the precision of military operations reports, because that is exactly what they were in the operational framework of the institutions producing them. Hitler himself was briefed on the progress of the killing operations. The question of precisely how much the broader German public knew, and how much they chose not to know, remains one of the most debated questions in all of Holocaust historiography. What is clear is that the operations were not secret at the operational level. The soldiers and police participating in them were telling their families in letters and in person. The photographs being sent through the military postal system constituted a distribution network for visual documentation of what was happening. The Ivan Horde photograph was one of hundreds, possibly thousands, of similar images created by men who saw no reason to be discreet about what they were doing. The accounting, Nuremberg, and what followed. The reckoning for the Einsatzgruppen came, partially and imperfectly, in the courtroom of Military Tribunal 2A in Nuremberg, Germany, in the autumn of 1947. The Einsatzgruppen trial, formerly titled United States of America versus Otto Ohlendorf et al., and designated case number 9 in the series of 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials, began on September 29, 1947. It was prosecuted by a 27-year-old lawyer named Benjamin Ferenc, who had been assigned the case at relatively short notice, and who prepared the prosecution largely on his own, working to the captured German documentary record that was available to Allied prosecutors after the war. Ferenc later described the evidentiary challenge as the inverse of what prosecutors normally face. There was not too little evidence, but an overwhelming abundance of it. The Einsatzgruppen had documented their own crimes in meticulous detail and submitted those documents through official channels. The prosecution's task was largely one of selection and presentation. 24 defendants were indicted. 22 were tried. Emil Hausmann died by suicide before trial, and Otto Rasch, commander of Einsatzgruppe C, the unit that operated in Ukraine, was deemed too ill to stand trial and died of Parkinson's disease in 1948. All 22 who were tried were found guilty on at least one charge. 14 were sentenced to death. The defense offer was essentially uniform across the defendants. Superior orders. They had been ordered to carry out these operations by lawful superiors within the chain of command of the German state. They had no choice. The Nuremberg tribunal rejected this defense in clear and unambiguous terms. The principle that a subordinate bears individual criminal responsibility for acts that constitute crimes against humanity, regardless of whether those acts were ordered by superiors, had been established at the original Nuremberg trials and was applied consistently in the subsequent proceedings. Otto Ohlendorf, the commander of Einsatzgruppe, was perhaps the most striking figure among the defendants. He was calm, articulate, and intellectually precise in his testimony. He admitted without hesitation that Einsatzgruppe had killed approximately 90,000 people during its operational period. He offered this figure not as a confession wrested from him under pressure, but as a statement of fact, delivered with the composure of an administrator confirming a production statistic. He acknowledged that the killing of women and children had been conducted under his command. He stated that he found these orders distasteful, but had carried them out because they came from the legitimate authority of the German state. He was sentenced to death and hanged on June 7, 1951, out of 14 death sentences delivered. Only 4 were carried out. The others had their sentences commuted. In most cases in terms of imprisonment that did not run their full length. Paul Blobel, who had commanded Sonderkommando for and organized the Babi Yar massacre, was executed. Most of the others who had been sentenced to death were released within a decade of the trial's conclusion. This outcome reduction of sentences, the early releases, the return to civilian life of men who had organized the killing of hundreds of thousands of people, is a separate and deeply uncomfortable chapter of the post-war history of Europe that raises questions about the seriousness of the international community's commitment to the principles it had proclaimed at Nuremberg. It is outside the scope of this particular story. But it is worth noting, precisely because the photograph from Ivan Horod is not only a document of the crime, it is also a document of the gap between what was done and what was answered for. Why the photograph matters. The question of seeing and knowing. There is a question that surrounds all Holocaust photography, and it surrounds the Ivan Horod photograph in particular. That goes beyond the historical record. It is a question of what it means to look at evidence of this kind, and what obligation that looking creates. The photograph was intercepted in 1942. A copy was sent to London in 1942. The Polish government in exile in London, one of the best-informed governments of any occupied nation, with intelligence networks extending into German-occupied territory and a systematic program of documenting atrocities for post-war accountability, possessed documentary evidence of mass murder operations being conducted against Jewish populations in occupied Ukraine before the end of 1942. They shared this evidence with the British government. They shared it with the American government. They publicized it through whatever channels were available to them. The response at the governmental level, at the level of policy and military decision-making, was inadequate to the scale of what was being documented. The mechanisms of what we now call genocide prevention did not exist. The concept of military operations designed to interrupt ongoing atrocity, the humanitarian intervention framework that developed haltingly in the decades after the war, was not part of the operational thinking of Allied commanders whose primary mandate was to defeat the German military in the field. The people being killed in the ravines and fields of Ukraine were not. In the framework of Allied military strategy, a population whose rescue was an operational objective. This is not a retrospective criticism designed to hold wartime decision-makers to standards that were not yet formulated. It is an accurate description of the gap between knowledge and action that characterized the international response to the Holocaust as it was occurring. The Allies knew they did not know everything, and some of what they were told they initially disbelieved. But they knew enough by 1942 to understand that a systematic program of mass killing was being carried out against civilian populations in German-occupied territory. The photograph from Ivan Horod sits in the historical record as a piece of evidence that arrived at the moment it was taken. It crossed the Warsaw Post Office. It was recognized and preserved by a teenager who understood its significance. It reached the people with the most direct interest in documenting the horror and communicating it to the world. And the world received it and processed it and continued making the calculations that wartime governments make. Calculations in which the weight assigned to the lives of people being killed in a specific location at a specific time is measured against other priorities, other constraints, other political and military realities. The woman in the photograph, whose name we do not know, who has never been identified, who wrapped her arms around her child in the last moments of her life, did not survive the gap between evidence and response. Neither did the child. Neither did the thousands of other people killed in Ivanhoe and the surrounding villages by Einsatzgruppe in its 1941 and 1942 operations. Neither did the 1.3 million other Jews killed by the Einsatzgruppen across the occupied Soviet territories. What survived was the photograph. What survived was the testimony of the perpetrators themselves, recorded in their operational reports and then in their Nuremberg courtroom statements. What survived was the scholarship, Raoul Hilberg's decades of archival work, Christopher Browning's analysis of Order Police Battalion 101 in Ordinary Men, the testimony projects conducted by institutions like Yad Vashem and the USC Shoah Foundation that have recorded survivor testimony for future generations. What survived was a legal framework constructed at Nuremberg, imperfect in its application, incomplete in its reach, that established for the first time in international law that individuals bear criminal responsibility for crimes against humanity, regardless of orders. Photograph historian Janina Struck, writing about the Ivanhoe image, noted that it functioned simultaneously as historical evidence and as something beyond evidence, as a direct confrontation with the reality of what human beings did to other human beings in a specific place, in a specific year, within living memory of people still alive today. It is not a reconstruction. It is not an illustration. It is the moment itself, frozen in silver halide on a piece of photographic paper, taken by a man who thought it was worth sending home. He was wrong about that. It reached the wrong hands. A teenage boy in a Warsaw post office understood something the man who sent it did not anticipate, that this image, which the sender treated as a record of routine work, was actually evidence of a crime, that it would outlast the German occupation of Ukraine, that it would outlast the German state that ordered the operations, that it would outlast, by decades, the men who were photographed and the men who stood behind the camera. The woman and child in the photograph did not survive, but the record of what was done to them did. And the record is the foundation of everything else. The accountability, however incomplete, that Nuremberg attempted. The legal frameworks that came after. The historical understanding that makes it possible to say, with documentary precision, what happened, who did it, and how many people it happened to. That is why the photograph matters. Not as an image of horror, though it is that, but as evidence, as documentation, as the proof, preserved by an unnamed teenager at a Warsaw post office, that this happened, and as a reminder, 80 years later, that seeing is not enough, and knowing is not enough, and that the gap between evidence and response is not a gap that closes itself. If this video gave you something to think about, if it brought this history closer to real for you, please take a moment and leave a like. History like this must be told, and it must be told with the accuracy and the weight it deserves. Subscribe to WW2 Tales if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell and leave a comment. Tell us what part of this history you knew and what was new to you. The conversation in the comments section of this channel is one of the most important things we do, because keeping this history alive, keeping it in the public consciousness, keeping it from becoming abstract or distant, requires people willing to engage with it honestly. We will never forget, and we will keep telling these stories for as long as there are people who need to hear them. Thank you for watching.